Are you looking to buy a chef knife? If so, you're in the right place. Let's try to find you a good knife. Now, if you haven't already, please consider supporting the channel by hitting that like and subscribe button. We also have an IG knife shop where we sell some knives to help support the channel, and we also have a merch store where you can grab some swag to help further support this madness. Now, quick disclaimer, I'm not affiliated with any of the brands mentioned in this video, nor am I being paid to include them in this video. So that way you guys know that my feedback is 100% honest and unbiased. Now, because knives are a very personal item and it is all dependent on your personal preference, this is not going to be a quote-unquote, here's a list of knives you should buy kind of video, whereas a guide to help you navigate through the thousands of knives out there to pick one that is right for you. Now, let's jump straight in. First, you want to establish a budget. Now, I understand not everyone has the same piggy bank, but with kitchen essentials like chef knives, the saying, buy one, cry once, really holds true. Now, about 10 years ago, my wife and I decided to move in together, and at the time, we were on a very tight budget, so we decided to get some pretty average cookware that is still functional today. So you can only imagine if you get some better quality items, they can easily last a decade. Now, if you do have the budget for it, you can get some heirloom items that can very easily be passed on to the next generation. Next, you'll want to determine what style of knife you want. And I'm not talking about the type of knife. The type of knife is, let's say this is a chef knife and this is a Santoku. So two different types of knives. What I mean by style is whether or not you want to go with a Western style or Japanese style. Western style has this type of handle where you can see it has a full tang construction with a bolster and everything. This is a Western type handle. Whereas a Japanese type handle or Japanese style knife has a hidden tang construction with a wooden handle. This type of handle is called Y handle. Now, speaking of tangs, let's go ahead and get one of the kitchen knife marketing myths out of the way. And the myth is that only full tang kitchen knives are considered good quality kitchen knives. Is there any truth to that? No, there's no truth to that at all. Now, in the kitchen setting, a well-built partial tang or hidden tang knife is just as robust as any full tang knife that you get. Now, in an outdoor setting or a field knife, there might be some truth to it. But even one of the favorite brands amongst bushcrafters, Mora, is built mostly with a partial tang construction. Next, you want to determine what size and profile knife you like. Now, size-wise, it is all a personal preference thing. Choose something that you're comfortable with. But don't forget to also consider whether or not the counter space that you're working with or the workspace that you have can accommodate the length of the knife. Now, profile-wise, do you like to raw cut or do you like to slice and chop? If you like a raw cut, you probably prefer something more of a Western German style grind like this made in right here, where it has a much more pronounced belly that accommodates for the raw cuts. But if you like to slice and chop, you probably like a flatter profile, which would suit you a little bit better, which would be closer to something like this, which is a Japanese or French style profile. Next, let's talk a little bit about comfortability. The knife has to be comfortable in your hands. While shopping for a knife, when possible, I highly recommend trying and handling the knife in person. But since we are in a digital age, most of the knives are not going to be available in retail stores. So you'll want to look for terms such as a crown spine or a rounded choil. A crown spine is where the spine of the knife, this part, is rounded off for comfortability. And a rounded choil, like the term says, is this choil area where the choil is rounded off, again, for comfortability. Both of these features make the knife a lot more comfortable, especially when you use something such as a pinch grip. Now, because of the higher manufacturing costs, most knives actually don't have these premium features, but I can show you right here in this video on how you can do it yourself. Speaking of comfort, I would highly recommend against a full bolster knife like this one. A full bolster knife, as you can see here, the bolster extends all the way down to the edge of the knife. You have all this extra material here. Whereas this is a half bolster knife where it still has a bolster, but it doesn't have that bulk of material that extends all the way down to the edge of the knife. Now, the reason I recommend against a full bolster knife is because it makes sharpening uneven. And also it adds unnecessary weight and really throws off the balance of the knife. Now, speaking of balance, I also want to mention that Japanese style knives have a more forward balance, whereas Western style knives are a little bit more handle heavy. So that is something to consider when you're picking out a knife. Next, you have to consider the type of steel that the knife is made out of and the Rockwell hardness. The first thing you need to do is determine what type of steel you want. Do you want stainless steel or do you want carbon steel? Now with stainless steel, it is a little bit easier on maintenance, but it is, remember, stainless, not stain free. And nowhere in the name does it say it is rust free either. Now with carbon steel knives, it is a little bit higher on the maintenance side, but it also really helps develop great knife care habits. Next, you'll see the term high carbon steel used and plastered all over knife ads. It is a very common knife marketing term, and I feel like it is overused and a very generalized term that doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of the material that the knife is made out of. And honestly, to me personally, it is also a red flag when you see companies hide behind terms like high carbon steel, and they don't really elaborate on what type of material or proprietary blend that they use for their knives. Because a knife company that has a proprietary blend or a high quality steel cannot wait to tell their customers about it, because that is one of their marketing strengths or marketing points to sell the knife. Whereas shadier companies tend to hide behind terms like high carbon steel and things like that to mask the fact that they don't use very high quality material to make their knives. So that is something that you'll want to keep in mind when you're shopping for a knife. Now back to the type of steel that the knife is made out of. Now the type of steel that the knife is made out of is important, but it is not everything when it comes to a knife. When I first started diving into knives, I thought the type of steel was the most important thing to a good knife. And that is not true at all. I'll openly admit that I was wrong at the time, and I'm still learning. The type of steel that the knife is made out of is only one of many components on what makes a good knife. So with all that being said, types of steel, one of the most common types of steel that you see nowadays is German steel. German steel is X50 CRMOV15 steel, and it is a very popular knife steel. It is a capable steel, but it is also a very, very average steel. At that same price point, I would much prefer something like an AUS 8 or AUS 10, because I personally, from my experience, like the performance and the edge that an AUS 8 or AUS 10 steel takes in comparison to a German steel. Now, AUS 8 and AUS 10 are great steels to start out with, and there are a lot more other premium steels that you can get, a lot more advanced metallurgy that you see, such as, powdered steels like this Swedish RWL34 steel. But these are all things that you have to consider when it comes to the price of the knife, because the more advanced the steel is, or the more I guess they call it super steels, these super steels are a lot more expensive. And because of the more expensive material, it will add on to the price tag of the knife. So that's something that you have to consider when shopping for the next knife. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Rockwell hardness. Rockwell hardness is how hard the knives are heat treated too. With Rockwell hardness, the law of diminishing return really does apply. Generally speaking, the higher the Rockwell hardness, the better the edge retention, but the trade-off is that the higher the Rockwell hardness, the more brittle the knife gets. Whereas the counterpart of a softer knife, the softer it is, the more durable and tensile strength it has, but it lacks edge retention. With softer knives, like the 58-59 Rockwell hardness range for most German knives, one of the pros is that you can actually hone the knife on a honing steel. That means when the knife starts getting dull, you can actually bring a little bit of that edge back and realign that edge with a honing steel. Whereas a higher Rockwell hardness knives, like most Japanese knives, you do not want to use a honing steel, because sometimes a honing steel can actually damage the knife and dull the knife instead. Whereas you want to use a strop or actually just touch it up on a higher grit whetstone. This 58-59 Rockwell hardness range is one of the most common amongst many knife manufacturers. And I think that's because this is kind of the middle ground sweet spot, where it's not overly soft where you have bad edge retention, or overly hard where the knife starts becoming brittle. Because once you get up past 60 Rockwell hardness, there are some extra care and precaution that you need to have while using the knife, because they do start becoming a little bit more brittle and it chips a little bit easier, and if you're not careful with it, you can actually crack and damage the knife. Lastly, you want to pay attention to the thickness and the grind of the knife. Now that's all personal preference, and you've heard me say this throughout the video. It's all personal preference. That's because when you're picking out a knife, It's your personal preference that matters, that will make this knife fit you. Now back to the thickness in the grind. The thickness in the grind of the knife is crucial to the performance of the knife. Now both thick and thin knives have their place in the kitchen. A thicker knife or a softer knife, well, let me pump the brakes there. A thicker knife is more robust, but it doesn't glide through ingredients very cleanly or delicately or wedge through the food. Whereas a thin knife will cut through with very little resistance and you can make very fine cuts with it. But the downside is that a very thin knife is also a very delicate knife. And that all boils down to having the right tool for the job. Let's just say you're trying to cut bone and really hard ingredients. You're going to probably prefer a knife that's thicker, a little bit more robust, a little softer so it doesn't chip when you're cutting into these hard ingredients. Whereas if you're trying to make some very delicate cuts or cutting sashimi and things like that, you're going to want a high Rockwell hardness knife that's also very thin behind the edge that can take a very acute angle so you can make those delicate cuts. Personally, my daily driver leans more towards the thinner side. That's because I just love a thin knife. I love the way how a thin and sharp knife feels when cutting through the ingredients. Like it's just glides through with no resistance at all, like the ingredient is not even there. It's such a beautiful feeling. Like it's a work of art. Like it's just amazing. But that's also because my daily meal prep doesn't involve a lot of hard ingredients. If you do have a lot of harder ingredients in your meal prep, you might want to opt for something that's not overly thin, not overly thick for your daily driver, like a workhorse grain. Now these workhorse grain is kind of that middle ground where it's just a little bit thicker, like the 𝐒𝐄𝐋𝐏 here, or this workhorse style kitchen knives ID knife, 𝐂𝐇𝐀𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐋, is that the workhorse grain is just thick enough where it has more heft and a little bit more robust, but the edge is not so thick that it starts wedging through the food. So this wraps up our updated chef knife shopping guide, and I hope you guys find it helpful or found some information in here that is helpful to you to help you pick out your next knife. And if you do like this video, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. It'll mean the world to me and help me support all of this madness. And I will see you guys next week. Bye.